Welcome to another episode Beyond Perception. My name is Simon, and it's my joy to welcome Boomer Anderson as my guest today. Welcome,
Hi,
Boomer.
Simon. Thank you for having me. This is going to be a fun conversation. I've enjoyed our interactions in the past, and I'm sure this will be no different.
Yeah, so to briefly introduce you to those of our listeners who don't know you yet. So, from what I know, you are an entrepreneur, podcast host, health optimization practitioner, and investor. You are the CEO of Smarter, Not Harder, and the CEO of the nonprofit Health Optimization Practice Europe. So I'm also very excited to have this conversation, and we have a bit of a joint history. The both of us, we worked
Yeah.
for Deutsche Bank. Yeah.
Cat's out of the bag, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And I guess we both figured there must be something else. There must be a little bit more than that. And I think we share a common interest in exploration. And that's also what let us bump into each other. I think it was the Biohacker Summit in Helsinki in 2019.
Hmm.
That's where we met for the first time. Since then, we had a couple of interactions, and I think this will be a very interesting conversation. And if that's okay for you, I would love to start with your journey since leaving Deutsche Bank. What was the motivation at that time to make that move?
Sure. Um, Very good question. So, unlike a lot of people in finance, I actually enjoyed what I was doing. And I was a part of a business that is broadly called debt capital markets. And so we helped companies and governments in South Asia raise money predominantly through fixed income instruments. And I had this wonderful experience whereby at the age of 26, I was kind of left alone to figure out this business in South Asia, which broadly spanned from India all the way to Indonesia. And over the next 4 years, I got to go to 40 countries. It was like very, very cool. There's it's great to experience the world in many ways in hindsight on somebody else's dime. And a lot of what I was doing, I can still see being put into place today, like how certain governments fund themselves. I know I was in the room when those strategies were developed. How certain companies fund themselves, same way, and or same result. But after about 4 years of running this territory, I kind of looked around and said, everybody else that was doing or had this role, um, essentially they were 20 to 30 years older than me doing this role. And I asked, is there more? Is there something else that I want to do here? Because at a fairly young age, I'd accomplished everything that I wanted to in finance. So I left my job somewhat pushed out the door by my now wife who wanted to live in Europe, right? And so I'm sure I could have transferred internally, and in many ways that would have been easier. But I wanted to challenge myself, and I find one of the reasons why people get into finance is to challenge themselves, because a lot of it is very performance oriented. And then once you kind of get to a certain point there, the question is like, how do you challenge yourself further? And that's where the whole entrepreneurship thing came up. And initially, I had gone down the realm of building an app because everybody at that point was building apps. This is around the time when like Uber was accelerating growth, and I was building sort of an alternative to something called ClassPass, which if you're familiar with that's a gym membership that allows you to go to multiple different gyms. And so I was working on an alternative to that. In the middle of it, I was diagnosed with a health issue. That health issue had something to do with my heart, and I wasn't really contented with what the sort of status quo doctors were telling me to do. And so that involved, taking a statin, basically sticking to cardiovascular exercise, and all these other kind of things, right? And so I began to ask questions of our current healthcare system and put demands on the current healthcare system that I found weren't really available. And I have nothing against the current healthcare system. I just kind of found holes and gaps where areas that needed to be filled in. Like, for instance, our current healthcare system is fantastic at dealing with conditions like, or certain conditions revolving around cancer, certain things around emergency medicine, etc. But if you have chronic conditions, or if you're just healthy and you want to feel like at your best, there was a gap there. And so we moved to Amsterdam, which is still currently the place I live, though we're going to be moving to the United States soon. And along that journey, I found a few doctors, medical doctors, who shared the same viewpoint of the world. And we ended up getting along to the point where we started a couple of companies together. And that is Smarter Not Harder Inc., which is the parent company of a nutritional supplement company called Prescriptions, as well as our nonprofit Health Optimization Medicine and Practice, which really is that framework, that clinical framework put together by my mentor, Dr. Ted Achacoso, that helps doctors and practitioners how to optimize for health rather than treat disease. So it's been a hell of a journey. And I'm sure there's definitely a lot of that journey that I've left out, but we'll leave it there and see where we can take this conversation.
So what I'm imagining, challenging yourself has been part of this journey since leaving the bank. And
absolutely, it's been a huge part of the journey, right? I think in many ways, there are a couple of types of people that become entrepreneurs. There are people that crave freedom, which I was certainly one of those. There are people that want to solve particular problems, and then there are people that want to test their limits. And I checked all three of those boxes.
And I shared it briefly in the introduction. You're also the host of the Decoding Superhuman podcast, and so you've been doing that for quite a while. And with your deep experience in optimizing health and optimizing for health, and the name of your show is Decoding Superhuman. So what would you say qualifies or characterizes a superhuman, or what is your perspective on our potential, who we truly are in any way or form? Who do you think we are?
Oh, that's a loaded question, Simon. So let's see how we unpack this. So I'll just give you a full confession on the name Decoding Superhuman, right? So I was sitting there in Amsterdam, and this was January of 2017. And I knew I wanted to host a podcast because at that time, podcasts were just really starting to, Tim Ferriss has been around, but Joe Rogan was starting to get listened to a lot more. And a few other people were doing it, but it wasn't a crowded space, right? And so I was sitting there and I was kind of writing down words in a journal and trying to piece something together. And I liked the word superhuman, but I really, really like the word decoding, right? And so why do I like both of those words? So a very simple definition of it, because you can look at Nietzsche and kind of look into the Übermensch and Thus Spake Zarathustra. That's a great book to read. But if you look at just sort of the idea of superhuman, it was more of taking from a vantage point of what makes somebody stand above the crowd, right? And that's where the decoding element comes in. And so when I look at the title Decoding Superhuman, I focus so much more on the decoding side of the equation than I do on the superhuman side of the equation, because superhuman means different strokes to different folks, right? And so in decoding, what I wanted to do was have conversations with people that were ultimately at the tops of their field, tops of their technologies, about how these things work and how we can use them in our everyday lives to allow us to live just a little bit above the clouds. Meaning, how do we get to a 1.2 version of Simon versus a 1.0 version, or even a 2.0 version? What are the contributions to that? And so Decoding Superhuman originally started out as a health podcast, because that was what I kind of used as my initial vector in on how do I unpack this problem that I had, which was cardiovascular. Generally, once you get to a certain point in unpacking any problem, at least this is the way my mind works, is that we start to look at the what's next, right? And so let me take you through the sequence of events and how that happened. So when I first started looking at the heart issue, I had a particular interest in complex adaptive systems, and I applied that to my body. And you start to realize that though most of our sort of medical system is organized in these very siloist nature, and that does have a purpose, a lot of these things have interactions. And so I started looking at the role that sleep played in overall health. I started looking, and this was before things like the Aura Ring even existed, right? I'm dating myself a little bit here. And I started looking at the role that nutrition played in overall health, because I was, one of these people that was following whatever the diet of the day was according to Men's Health. And I clearly got something wrong. I started looking at the role that exercise, and too much exercise specifically, played in health. And, through it all, there was an elephant in the room that I wasn't addressing, right? And that was stress. And so stress, and particularly anxiety. So if anxiety is sort of the forward-looking view of stress, so I'm always looking to the future, and depression is sort of the backward-looking view. Anxiety has been my little helper. I call it my little helper since I was very, very young. And what that meant was I gone through a series of panic attacks, but it all motivated me to do more in this world. And I also had this sort of classic male point of view that, stress is something that I eat for breakfast or whatever, right? And I don't need to admit that I'm stressed. And so I began realizing this partially because I could not perfect my sleep without addressing stress first. And so then, you started having, you can see this in the podcast, I started having conversations more and more about stress, things like heart rate variability, because my background, similar to yours, being in finance, involved a lot of data, right? And so I was very, very comfortable with data and metrics. So I started looking at heart rate variability, how to improve that. You start getting into conversations about breath work, various technologies, and eventually you come across this thing, meditation. And what's funny is that, Simon, I was a meditator for years. And, I actually came into meditation through transcendental meditation in Singapore. And, it rightfully so gets a lot of shit from people because you're being taught a mantra-based meditation, which you can probably find the mantra on the internet by Googling, and you pay a lot of money for it. But what I valued about transcendental meditation is that it gave me somebody who is going to hold me accountable to meditate twice a day for 20 minutes over the course of a week. And that got me going on meditation. And so I came back to meditation with a little bit new fervor. And I've sort of underpin all of this is sort of this interest in what my friend Patrick Hanaway likes to term wisdom of the elders, right? And so what is the wisdom that has been passed down generation by generation for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that kind of helps us live better lives, helps us maybe be more superhuman? And so along this line, I started reading a lot more about different, I guess you would call them spiritual traditions, and getting much more into the history. And what I particularly enjoy doing myself is overlaying these various cultures and seeing what the similarities are. And, there are quite a number of similarities, which we can get into, but also we can, been an amazing journey. I have to tell you that, Simon. It's just been a lot of unpacking, repacking, unpacking other things, and getting into a little bit more of what it means to be human.
Thank you for sharing that all with us. And when I look back at my approach to biohacking, it was it changed my life and my health dramatically. So that there was a very helpful part in that, but it also led to me taking control, or wanting to take control over everything, and it ended up being very stressful and not leaving any truth of life to me. And I think that that also contributed to me having a burnout, literally for a couple of months, where I wasn't able to do really anything. So there seems to be a sweet spot of taking charge of circumstances, or planning life consciously, but then also leaving a little bit of space still for maybe the unknown. Or what's your perspective on my story, or in general, maybe an approach or the do's and don'ts to biohacking or taking charge of one's circumstances?
Yeah, and there was a question you asked earlier about learning about the self, which I would love to get into, but let's tackle the health and the biohacking question first. And I've never really shared this with anybody, and so this is going to be the first time I'm publicly talking about it. And so bear with me for just a moment as I kind of I'll get my thoughts together as I speak.
Sure, yeah,
You
please.
mentioned something in my bio, which I think is somewhat important to highlight, and I didn't necessarily do it yet. So, as part of my role and the chief executive officer of Health Optimization Medicine and Practice, our nonprofit, I'm also an active health optimization practitioner. And I work specifically with entrepreneurs who are between the ages of 35 to 45, and they're predominantly male. They happen to be where most of them are from where you're from, Simon. But I do have clients all over the world. And you can generally bucket these people and pretty much everybody into a few categories. And so the first category is somebody who's really coming at health for the first time. And this is a person who they maybe have either had a recent diagnosis, or they haven't really taken care of themselves, or perhaps they've kind of taken care of themselves in the wrong way, resulting in a diagnosis, and they need help. And this is where things like data, particularly lab work, but also wearable data, become very, very useful, because at this point, you're really still trying to identify what the underlying issues are. And within the Home Hope framework, what we teach people is something called metabolomics. And metabolomics is your cellular level health, where you are now and where you have been in the recent past. Now, why is that useful? It is really the only way that I know how to most precisely identify what supplements you need, what lifestyle modifications you need to make in order to achieve something called nutrient balancing. And if you can balance the health of the cell, the fractal takes over. So you have this one bucket of people that are sort of coming at health for the first time, and data does what? It brings awareness to something, right? And so you start paying attention to it because you have that feedback loop every morning that states, hey, you're not sleeping so well. Maybe you should put down that glass of wine right before bed. Maybe you should not go on some sort of drug binge on the weekend, right? Like, there's alternatives to that. And so you have your group of people there, and then they kind of migrate over time. They've brought some awareness to this, and now they're getting into category 2. And category 2, really at that point, what helps. So at one end of category 2, you're still bringing familiarity to that data. You're teaching people like what the data represents, what are the potential causes and effects. But broadly speaking, this person in category 2 has built some routines. And why are routines important? Well, routines, your whole body, and one thing you'll have to remind me to explain this a little bit more later, Simon, is there is a link between my love of finance and my love of health. And I can, I'll just try and unpack that a little bit right now. So in category 2, as you're kind of bringing awareness to your body and the things that you intake and how they impact your data, you start to realize that things like routines really, really impact your data. Now, why is that? This is the field of biological rhythms. And what we're doing here is looking at sensorial cues like sunlight, or like waking up in the morning, or the timing of your meals, and something that's called time restricted feeding. And we're really helping your body get into various rhythms. Those rhythms will help you glucose better, which will help you improve your energy levels. And a lot of that does start with sleep. So this is chronobiology.
Mm.
And so in this category 2, you have your data, you've built some routines. Now, towards the other end of category 2, where you've been in category 2 for a while, is when the obsession really starts, right? And these are people who probably have listened, and I have nothing against these guys. They're great people, and I love what they've done for the world in terms of making people aware of alternatives. But they've been listening to the Tim Ferrisses, the Ben Greenfields of the world, and they start to hear about all of these routines and all of these things, and you start to add it to your routine because you think it's interesting. And if I get just 20 minutes of red light today and every day, then my day is going to be that much better. And by the end of this sort of category 2 bunch, you're starting to get into that. I want to go from 90% to 100%. And you start looking at various nootropics and these kind of things. And all of these are great, but perhaps they need some sort of moderation, right? Because then you reach a point like you were just describing earlier, where you can be in some sort of state of burnout almost due to data and due to overwhelm, because there are not enough hours in the day to do the biohacks or the routines that you want. And pretty soon your morning routine takes up 3 hours, and who has time for that? But if you miss one element of your 3-hour morning routine, your day's fucked. And all of a sudden, like, the routine and all of those things you're doing to help you get healthy is now dictating how your day goes. That's usually the sign that you need to cross over into category 3. Like, you've done enough to know that the data is connected, and you've done enough to know that the data is connected to your how you feel. You've done enough to know the foods you're eating and sort of how they impact your cell biology. And then you go into category 3. And that's really where you probably need to relax a little bit on those data points and relax a little bit more on those routines. Because after all, like, expertise is just relaxed control of your material, right? And this is a quote that Dr. Ted gave me, and I'm going to use it liberally here. And so relaxed control of your health may mean that it's okay on a Friday night to go and have Mexican food or with my wife, or it's okay. I'm not an alcohol drinker, but like to have one drink after work. It's okay to not do a 3-hour morning routine, and maybe you stick it to three variables. So in each of these categories, the role of coach becomes increasingly more important because, or practitioner. And so you need to partner with somebody to first help you bring awareness to your cellular level biology. You need to also partner with somebody to hopefully avoid that last part of category 2, which is the burnout. And then you need to partner with somebody to help you take away those devices, those tools that helped you get to the point. Because at category 3, there's a sort of, ultimately what we're talking about here is like, how do I build presence to my life and how to build presence to health? And I generally find that if people are present for their life, they're a lot happier and a lot more health optimized. And category 3 is a lot more about helping people unpeel those devices that help them get to where they are, to really just uncover what is needed to live that optimal life.
So what you're describing is really using biohacking as a tool, but then be careful that it does not create a dependency on those tools or becomes a purpose in itself to just continuously optimize and control.
Exactly. So one of the phrases that I love are terms that got tossed around a lot in finance is this idea of being anti-fragile, right? And you hear it get tossed around in the health space a lot, but it's good to define a term. And so anti-fragile is something that gets better in the face of adversity, right? And ultimately, it could also be termed resilience in certain ways, right? And the example that Taleb uses in his book is airplanes. So when an airplane crashes, our planes get actually better at flying. And you can also see this for a human body. Now, what we just talked about there in category 2, you're adding routines, you're adding different pieces of data, you're adding supplements. In this case, you're adding nootropics, you're adding all kinds of stuff. But what happens to you, Simon, if I take one of those things away? I'm sure now you're probably fine. But when you were in that situation where you are kind of almost owned by your routines. What happens when I get 6 hours of sleep instead of 8? What happens when I don't get my afternoon nap? What happens when I don't wear my blue light blockers at night? Those questions will actually help you understand whether or not you're anti-fragile and building something that is indeed health optimized, or if you just actually made a more fragile structure.
Makes absolutely sense, and mirrors very much my own experience, and also the process which I started embarking on over the last years, you could say. And that's also something I want to ask you, because we mentioned who are we, or my question before, who are we? And and something you said before, it was along the lines of decoding how to be above the crowd, or how to be above the cloud.
The clouds, yeah,
the clouds. Yeah. So what that implies to me is also to really reflect on your own motivation, or who you are, or your own egoic structure, or how you seek yourself validation, or kind of from which attitude or motivation you approach life towards. And you also talked briefly about your encounter with anxiety. And if I were to answer what you asked me before, it was anxiety of not having control, or not being perfect. No, if I wouldn't have the ideal circumstances. And so by unplugging from that, I was exposed to fear, to the fear which unconsciously was kind of motivating me to keep on optimizing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple ways that I kind of began to unpack this, because the first was a sort of realization of my interests. And if you look at sort of the thread between finance and health, what is sort of the commonalities there? I have a general and an incredibly large interest in human behavior, and really understanding what motivates us to do the things we do. Why do some people have the need to invade countries? Why do others not seem to be able to get out of bed in the morning? And finance allows you to see these behaviors reflected on a large scale. So you can see human behavior reflected on a large scale through something like a stock market, right? And we can see our buying behavior, our desires, all of that reflected in the stock market. Then you flip it to health, and you start to get into conversations about biochemistry, and you start to get into conversations about how things like neurotransmitters affect the very thoughts that are going on between our heads. You very quickly realize that we have no control at all over any of that. Think about the process of mitosis. So mitosis is cell division. We do not control cell division. I don't know, Simon, maybe you do. Like, maybe, Simon, you are speaking to your cells right now and you're telling them to divide, right? But I certainly do not know when my cells are going through cell division, mitosis, or apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. And so, there was this general realization that the thing that I valued so much in my life, I was one of those entrepreneurs who became an entrepreneur because I wanted to control my life, right? I wanted to have control or freedom over what I was doing. And then you start to realize very quickly that you have almost zero control. You can also enhance this experience through areas like psychedelics, right? And it was funny, as I began to unpack the stress component here, and as I began to unpack using, broadly speaking, biohacks, I kind of noticed the areas where I was hesitant to dive into were usually the most effective for me. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. I was hesitant for the longest time to try psychedelics. Now, why is that? From the age of 14 to 18, I had several friends that had died or been incapacitated from the use of psychedelics or otherwise drugs. One of them killed himself over a mushroom experience. I was 18 years old when that happened. Another one killed himself, or he was killed after being a cocaine dealer. And these kind of experiences, they kind of stick to you in a little bit, little ways. And so I found that was, ultimately, if there's a resistance, I need to look into why that resistance was there. And psychedelics, we do know, we can get into sort of the sense of self, but a lot of this resistance and a lot of these stresses and anxieties, they're caused by something that is commonly referred to as the ego, or the self-referential system. And we know that there are certain areas of the brain where the ego is believed to exist, right? And so the default mode network is commonly talked about in these conversations. And when you look at psychedelics and their power, what they allow you to do is to see what quote unquote life is like without an ego. And so at this time, when you start facing a resistance, sometimes the teacher shows up to your door. And I met a group of people who were using psychedelics for therapy, and I had profound breakthroughs in very short periods of time, just by being able to shut down the default mode network and to see that there was something or almost nothing there without the ego, and the ability to live with complete presence, and for a certain honeymoon period after that. The psychedelics were able to kind of superimpose that, and then you can use tryptamines to completely shut down the default mode network. You can use aerocyclohexylamines like ketamine to give you that experience of going into a K-hole or shutting down the default mode network. And then you can also look at some of the cathinones or the phenethylamines, and those can actually increase the activity of the ego, make you feel like you're quote unquote God, which you are anyway, but you can make you feel like you are quote unquote God. And you can use those to contrast each other to actually make you aware of when your ego is up, when your sense of self is up, and allows you to actually provide a distance between your sense of self and your true self. So again, there was a lot there, but psychedelics did help me unpack the role of anxiety really in my life.
And what would you say? How did that happen? Like, what did happen? Your understanding of yourself, or is that before you like more distance to the egoic structure, or what do you
Sure.
attribute it to that transformation you said in a very short time?
So I want to take you through a process that we've kind of actually built out into a retreat. And I'm saying there are a few doctors involved, but because they're Western medicine doctors, I don't really want to expose their identities, because a lot of this in certain jurisdictions
Mhm.
is still questionably legal, right? And we can get into whole debates as to why psychedelics, when done in an appropriate setting, should be used as medicine. And I think MAPS has done a really good job of presenting that, particularly with MDMA. But let's kind of break down this experience a little bit. So enlightenment, which is a phrase that gets tossed around quite liberally across various spiritual traditions, whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, pre-Buddhist Bon. Some of the Toltecs actually kind of refer to this, albeit in different terms. If we just define that as freedom from the illusion of the self, and we'll talk about what that kind of looks like. So let's get into what that kind of looks like on a day-to-day basis. So right now, Simon, we're having a conversation. We probably have various thoughts going on in our head, and our thoughts are just really neural network depolarizations popping up, right? And those thoughts at sometimes hijack us. So I am Boomer the banker, right? And so I need to go out and finance, and right?
Mhm.
And that ultimately distracts us from being present. And if you think about that, even though it's a future maybe it's a future-facing thought. So anxiety, future-facing thought, or depression, a past thought. It's all occurring in your head in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
But you may not recognize that because you're attached to that very thought. For instance, I have to go pick up my wife at 5 p.m. That's a future-facing thought occurring in this moment. The freedom from the illusion of the self, or enlightenment, is the recognition that that thought, or the awareness that that thought is just a thought, and it is occurring in my head in this moment. It may not go away, but I'm not attached to it. It's just occurring in my head in this moment. And so the how of this, or the how of that you get to see the recognition, is really the format of what we've developed at this retreat. And so I like to use the term psychoplastogens rather than psychedelics, because psychoplastogens refer to compounds or chemical structures that rapidly alter your brain structure or neuroplasticity. And so in a psychoplastogenic retreat, you can imagine that we're using those three categories that I mentioned earlier. So phenethylamines, tryptamines, cyclohexylamines, in ways that allow us to increase the recognition of the self, or to give you a freedom or a sense of freedom from the illusion of this self. So if you follow a particular cadence, and I'll give you some examples of something like taking MDMA first, which MDMA is a phenethylamine, and it helps really raise the ego. It's really good for bonding, right? It helps bring awareness of or it helps show you just how big your ego can be. So that area that hijacks your thought hijack process, it helps superimpose that on you. There are other substances that are broadly phenethylamines that will also help generate this experience. So you have this superimposed ego, and then you go for your next night, and that becomes a tryptamine. And a tryptamine are, generally speaking, compounds like ayahuasca, like psilocybin. LSD is typically referred to as tryptamine. And these actually help you realize that the ego is really just a figment of your imagination. It's an area of your brain called the default mode network, which is created to help you realize through an evolutionary process that maybe you shouldn't eat those berries because they had poison, or maybe that cat in the woods is something you should run away from. But now, as we, largely speaking, don't have any predators, it's maybe not as useful as it used to be, but it's still there. And so the predators instead are phones, or emails, or social media networks, etc. And so a tryptamine actually helps you realize that by shutting down the default mode network. People commonly refer to this as ego death, because sometimes it can feel like that. And you can run that pattern of superimposing the ego and then contracting the ego, superimposing the ego and contracting the ego. And what that allows you to do is to create a distance. It allows you to create a freedom from that illusion of the self. Because we do realize that if we are indeed present in this moment, like I am having this conversation with Simon right now. We are in two different jurisdictions. You're in Mexico, I'm in California. We're having this beautiful conversation, but I'm present, I'm here in this moment. And I do have the freedom from that illusion of that self-character, who may, pop up every once in a while and say, like, hey, Boomer, why did you say that on this podcast? That has nothing to do with this. But for the most part, it's about, creating that freedom. And the how really is the beauty of that retreat. And so we have 5-7 day retreats that somebody can attend. We overlay some of these biohacking technologies on it, because we know that psychoplastogens, because they increase neuroplasticity, there's an opportunity window for us to help you rewire your brain using certain devices or certain videos that we may watch, that kind of stuff.
And neuroplasticity, it's rewiring your brain in a different way. So when you speak of becoming aware of your egoic structure, that reflects in different pathways in your brain, or how would you describe that?
So neuroplasticity, and I unfortunately am not a walking chat GPT, but let me try and just define this. So neuroplasticity is is the ability to alter your brain, essentially, right? And so let me give an example, because there's a couple of them out there. And so when I say the term psychoplastogens, there's a category of compounds that, when used, can alter the structure of your brain. And so let's give an example. So DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, which is one of the actives in ayahuasca, promotes neurogenesis, or the growth of new neurons in your brain. Ketamine and ariocyclohexylamine is, after 6 hours, promotes dendrite growth. And so you can form new connections in your brain. And so when, let me give you an example from my own life. When I was first starting to do this, and actually I still do this, once a quarter, about right now, I will take higher dose ketamine. And higher dose ketamine all provides both that ego reset. So it allows me to kind of wipe the board, go tabula rasa style. And it allows me to recognize sometimes when my ego may be up. Like, let's say this week I'm in San Francisco. There are a few things that I need to do that are very pertinent to San Francisco. I need to go talk to this person, that person, this person, that person, because of my role as chief executive officer, right? But when I take ketamine, that role drops out and I'm just there. I'm present, right? And after 6 hours, there is the growth of dendrites. And I can, during that 6 hour, or after that 6 hour period, and for a period of time thereafter, feed my brain information to encourage the rewiring of it. And so when I initially started doing this, and even to this day, actually, a lot of that feeding of the brain comes from teachings of Taoism, right? A lot of what my life has been up until the age of 30 was push, push, push. I'm going to make this happen no matter what. And there's actually an exercise that is very useful to entrepreneurs in particular, of letting go. And so when we start to talk about Taoism, Wu Wei, which is sort of the 2,000-year-old term for flow, and start to get into conversations about, I mean, this is even represented in Fight Club, right? Like, just let go when they're driving the car down the street. You know, those kind of situations where I'm not trying to control everything. I'm just trying to let go, let things be, and see what happens. Those are something that I could start to rewire in my brain around that hour 6 time period. It's also a great time for super learning. I told you earlier, one of my particular areas of interest is complex adaptive systems. Usually I will try to rewire my brain by feeding myself something fairly difficult to digest on a learning process. And, you know, I'm not a mathematician, but I'm trying to learn this, which is a very mathematical exercise. And so I'll use those types of periods where I do have a neuroplastic window to increase things like dendrite growth, et cetera.
And these rewirings, they are permanently, or is it that you continuously need to kind of sustain a certain supplementation?
So Simon, last time I spoke to you, you were in Switzerland, right? And
Yes,
you know,
yeah.
picture Switzerland's a great place to go skiing. I think anybody listening to this can agree to
It
that.
is, yeah.
And so picture a ski slope, right? And if you're on a ski slope and you go down you're the first person out during the day, and let's just say that the runs haven't been groomed, it's a fresh powder day. You're going down and you create your own path, right? And so when you're dealing with neuroplasticity and you're changing your brain structure, it allows you to kind of create that path to go down after that fresh snow. Now, if you were to then go about your life and do everything completely opposite, yeah, maybe that fresh snow comes back, but there's no real path. But if you were to reinforce it, you can really start to dig in, and then pretty soon it's sort of 4 o'clock in the afternoon and the whole trail has paths to go down, right? The idea here is to start something new and to start something in an accelerated fashion. I told you earlier that I found psychedelics to be one of the most potent things for me to have a higher quality of life because they're quick. And one of the things that I absolutely love about using some of these substances is that they can accelerate that adaptation. And so while In certain cases, it may be permanent, but I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. There is probably some work that you'll have to do afterwards in order to help them be permanent. But it helps really start to build those initial tracks, or sometimes take those tracks and dig them deeper.
So the picture I get is kind of giving you a new chance, but then it's still up to you what you do with that. Like you mentioned earlier, routines, or like to make choices which are more aligned with how you love it to be.
What these substances do, and a lot of what these I use the phrase wisdom of the elders, some of these traditions provide, is another sense of perspective, right? And let's take for example something like lysergic acid diethylamide, so LSD. You take 100 to 300 micrograms of LSD, you're going to be strapped to a rocket and you do not know where you're going. But it will provide you a different sense of perspective. You may, particularly with psilocybin, LSD, and certain times MDMA, people report a sense of oneness and more connectedness to the world. You get a lot of those through spiritual teachings as well. I could speak to certain traditions a little bit better than others, but for example, Dzogchen, which the tradition I'm most familiar with is pre-Buddhist Bon. It allows you to, embrace an interconnectedness of yourself with the world, and it allows you through again that teaching of Dzogchen. So I am the sky, or that having a feeling of being 2 inches above the clouds, as Alan Watts describes it. Alan Watts is more Zen, but it just allows you to have an accelerated view of what some of these people are talking about when it comes to these spiritual teachings. So depending on your flavor, you can actually combine the two, which is what I've sort of done in my own life.
And with your experience, is it possible to recover from any brain injuries or traumas, or is like the brain in essence recoverable?
So this is this, now putting psychedelics aside, and now we're kind of getting into a slightly more medical realm. And so, Simon, full disclosure, I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on the internet, right? And so we can group those what you just said into you have trauma, and there's personal trauma, and a lot of people use psychedelics to resolve personal trauma. Whether that be sexual trauma, whether that be just relationship trauma, or something that you may have had an experience of your relation to your family when you're young, which you didn't realize that it impacted you so much as to who you are today. And sometimes psychedelics can help you both realize that and hopefully resolve those situations relatively quickly. Now, when it comes to brain trauma, you're starting to get into the realm of traumatic brain injury. And so a lot of things are recoverable if you have the right tools, whether that be hyperbaric oxygen therapy or something else. But when you start to get into the elements of brain trauma, you really, and personal trauma, you should be working with a physician, a psychiatrist, somebody who is very familiar with the aspects of the brain and how they operate and how you can recover. We've made great strides in the area of traumatic brain injury. A lot of that is due to the fact there's been a lot of money invested in that area recently. And then, we're now as a society starting to address this trauma concept a lot more. We're also starting to be a lot more open about discussing that. And so it's no longer taboo to necessarily be working with a talk therapist, to necessarily be working with psychedelics. But in both cases, if you suspect you have some sort of element of trauma, whether that's traumatic brain injury or other trauma, please go see a doctor or a physician. Those are probably your best avenues for starting points.
And for someone who's now listening and would love to improve their mental or physical brain capacities and is interested into neuroplastical supplements or treatments, what would you suggest is a good way to go about having like obviously an experience such as you're facilitating in your retreat is a possibility. How often would you recommend to do something like that? Is that like once a year or?
Sure. I want to build kind of a framework for you. I'm going to do this live, so I haven't
Mhm.
really you haven't previewed these questions with me, Simon. So I'm going to try and do this live.
Sure,
And
please.
so
Yeah.
we're going to start with the health optimization component, and then
Mhm.
we'll kind of build from there. And hopefully this will give people a sense.
Mhm.
So the first thing that I would do if I were starting afresh or just looking for health or brain optimization, what I would do is I would go out and find somebody who knew what they were doing. So we have a nonprofit. Again, it's a nonprofit. I make zero money from this, but health optimization medicine in practice. You can go and find a health optimization practitioner who can take you through the steps of analyzing your metabolome. So knowing exactly where your cells are now and when your cells have been recently. That will tell you exactly what supplements you need to take and in the right amounts. So that practitioner will work with you and create a plan for you. That's something that you can do twice a year. And so you get that testing, you'll get blood, urine, and stool testing, and that practitioner will work with you to clear out things like parasites, things that you may not know actually exist in your body. It'll work with you to balance your nutrients, and they'll work with you to, even if they're a medical doctor, to balance your hormones. So you've got that element, and think about it as a fractal, right? So if I can optimize the smallest part of you, which is that the smallest part that we can analyze is the cell. If I can optimize the smallest part of you, it's going to fractalize out into you as a person, right? And so you start there by working with that practitioner. You take your supplements, and in the most diligent of people, that nutrient balancing does take time. It takes about 6 to 9 months. But as you're doing that, you can start to ask the questions about, okay, how do I optimize the thoughts between my head, right? Like
Mhm.
most entrepreneurs that I work with, at some point you realize that the thing that's getting in the way between them and what they want to achieve is usually the thoughts going on in between their head. So this begs a question of, do I get a different type of coach, like a performance coach? Do I get a psychologist, a talk therapist, or do I end up with this realm of psychedelics, right? And what I will say about this is psychedelics are not for everybody. There are certain people that shouldn't take psychedelics because they're on certain medications. And there's certain people that shouldn't take psychedelics because they may not like what they want to see, or maybe they have some sort of bias, and that's totally okay. Or prejudice, I guess would be the technical term. The one thing I did forget on the health optimization side is your health optimization practitioner, once you've optimized your basic cell, can help you optimize your brain cells. And that gets into a conversation about nootropics. And nootropics are just simply agents influence our lifestyles that can help you optimize the performance or the health optimization of your brain. So now we're into the realm of psychedelics, and performance coaching, talk therapy, all of those do well as long as you have the right partner for you. And you have to do some time to understand yourself and to understand who you work best with. I tend to work really well with a very stern performance coach, but also with the use of these compounds. And so then there's the question of psychedelic therapy. And, again, with any of these, my advice is sort of find the person who knows what they're doing, knows what they're talking about, and try to work with them. And so the rhythm that I follow is one of a microdosing protocol, which is twice a week. I'll microdose on Mondays and Thursdays. And Simon, I know it's Monday as we're recording this, and I'm not microdosing today. I'll microdose tomorrow because I wanted to have this conversation with you. But Mondays and Thursdays are typically my microdosing days. I usually do these retreats. So these retreats are actually, before the retreat comes the once a quarter. Once a quarter, I'll take something like ketamine to help me dissociate from my ego. That will allow me to recognize that really a lot of what we're doing here is just a game, and it should be fun. And then, these larger scale retreats, depending on whether or not you've done this before, you may want to try maybe going to a smaller retreat that's maybe 1 or 2 days. And you can do that with a tryptamine to give yourself some experience with these tryptamines. But these larger scale retreats, I probably do once, max twice a year. And those are the retreats and the time I give myself to really focus on resetting my brain, trying to work on this experience of freedom from the illusion of the self, and laying those new ski tracks so that maybe my sort of earlier desires to control everything start to relax themselves.
That's incredibly interesting. Thank you for giving us a sneak peek into what you're up to. So from what I'm understanding is psychedelics are the most potent agents to initiate neuroplasticity, pardon.
So I would say it's hard to quantify that. And from what we understand now, they certainly are a potent agent in neuroplasticity, but there's a lot you can do on your own without psychedelics in order to initiate neuroplasticity. Learning is certainly one of them. Learning something difficult is one. And engaging with difficult material. There's also nootropics that you can take. Psychedelics do offer a very potent way, but it's hard for me to say the most potent for sure. And again, I'm really not selling anything here. I'm just having a conversation with my friend Simon. And so maybe if I was a marketer, I would say, yeah, they're the most potent and to go buy my retreat, right? But I'm not going to. So I would say if it speaks to you, then, and if it's something that you're interested in, I'm always happy to have conversations on this topic, but different strokes for different folks, right?
Very much appreciated to give this very unique perspective on spiritual exploration, psychedelics, but also biohacking. Would you say that, I think you initially said you are continuously challenging yourself. Is this still something which is at the core of your life, or what's your approach to life in terms of what vision are you following on? What's kind of at the top of your mind in terms of what's your life about?
So this is an interesting question, right? Because up until recently, there was always a destination when I mapped it out in my mind. When I do X, I will be X. And I was fortunate enough to achieve a relatively high level of success early on in life. That doesn't mean that I'm like financially independent and doing nothing right now, but what I realized very quickly is that sort of destination piece was very much a moving target for me. Like I wasn't one of these people that said, when I make this much money, I'm going to be happy. I said that, but then the goalposts got moved very quickly. And a lot of it had to do with titles and achievements and that kind of stuff. And I'm not perfect by any means. But what I would say is that I am settling into the idea that the journey is the destination. And while that sounds trite, it's something that I try to reinforce on an everyday basis, which is, the idea of being present in this moment, in this conversation with you. For me, that's the objective. And so, Simon, both you and I came from banking. And in banking, we oftentimes get into conversations about return on investment, right? And so for those people who are not listening to this, return on investment is basically I invest X, I get back Y. What is my percentage gain there? Right now, what I'm looking for is the return on presence. And so how do I optimize my days to be present? How do I optimize my experience of living so that I can be present? Because I told you earlier that I traveled 40 countries in 4 years, had a huge territory, 8 more Michelin star restaurants than I can imagine, right? Out of the 40 countries, I cannot tell you one of them where I wasn't on my phone at some point during the day trying to optimize my schedule for the future, right? And so now what I'm trying to do is optimize for every moment. And that still involves the deep study of biochemistry. It still involves trying to build businesses. But rather than focusing on, okay, when I hire this person, I will be happy. How do I get happy right now in the moment with having to edit this document or something? And that's really what I'm focused on right now.
That's beautiful. And it's the analogy from my perspective, for what you shared before. You could say our healthcare system is really focused on getting rid of something, problem focused, and what you shared before is more about health. Like it's a focus for something new. It's not to get rid of something, but health optimization, and that's also kind of my own journey, or what I'm recognizing more and more, that like first in hindsight, how much of my past behavior and action was motivated by what I don't want. And so that tended to recreate, or like kind of keep that underlying motivation in my life, which was fear
Yeah.
or like resentment to what I didn't want to have in my life. And so that kind of, I kept that dragging with me through life. And when I started to open my focus to that dynamic, it was not very pleasant, because it showed the part I played in my misery. Yeah. But it also opened my perspective to, okay, let's start as an experiment, approach life from a different perspective. What would I love to experience? What would I love to bring into the world? What you could say, very much inspired by art, you know, as an expression for the sake of it, not to get better or to get something out of it, or to get more money or more recognition. And that change in focus had a very tremendous effect in how I'm experiencing life and my life quality. And I feel, from when I'm listening to you, it very much on a similar path.
Yeah, it's the Simon I'm talking to now is a very different Simon than the Simon I met in what was it, Finland, back in 2019, and I think I met you a couple of days later in LA at Summit. So
that's true.
It's a very different experience. And, I'm looking forward to seeing the Simon in 6 months, or, the next time we talk, because it's, the journey is a difficult one. For certain people, it can be easy. For me, I've chosen to, I guess, make it difficult because I had an obsession with control or anger towards something. But it can be very rewarding. And, for me, there's nothing more rewarding that when I, go and travel to San Francisco and have all these meetings, or go and present at a conference, for instance. The most rewarding thing for me is when I come back to wherever Bessie, my wife, is, and we have dinner together, and the phone, it may be in my pocket, but I'm not checking it. And at the end, she says, "Thank you for being present with me," because I haven't always been that way. And she's known me throughout the entire journey. And it's that's the reward for me. So thank you for having me on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. I know we talked about a lot of things, health optimization, psychedelics. Didn't get quite so much into the spiritual side of stuff, but we can get into that maybe another time.
Yes, for sure. It will be my joy. Yeah, it was very interesting, very insightful. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us, Boomer. And if that's okay for you, we will link details to what you're up to and your projects and the companies you're involved with in the show notes of this episode. So everybody who's listening and watching this can learn more about or get in touch with you. So thank you once again. Yeah. I wish you all the best, Boomer, and also to everybody who's listening and watching this. Thank you for being here. Be well, and see you next time.
Thank you, Simon.